let us be clear. This is not a war on terrorism. Terrorism is an activity. This is a struggle with radical Islamists in both their militant and their stealth form. The militant form believe in using military power in one form or another. The stealth form believes in using cultural, intellectual, and political, but their end goal is exactly the same. The fight against Sharia and the madrasas and mosques which teach hatred and fanaticism is the heart of the enemy movement from which the terrorists spring forth. And it's time we had a national debate on this, and one of the things I'm going to suggest today is a federal law which says no court anywhere in the United States under any circumstance is allowed to consider Sharia as a replacement for American law, period. And let me draw a sharp distinction between those Muslims who live in the modern world and those Muslims who would radically change the modern world. Radical Islamists want to impose Sharia on all of us for legitimate reasons. And let me be quite clear. You can respect your adversary without agreeing or giving in. They have profound, deeply held beliefs, and one of the great challenges for secularists is they can't understand the level of passion that a belief which is derived from an underlying religious form leads one to have. Which is why, frankly, deeply believing Christian and Jewish Americans have a much better understanding of what's going on than do secular intellectuals in deracinated universities looking out of their ivory tower, trying to wonder what it is that would lead people to kill themselves and having no comprehension of the emotions and the depth of passion engaged. So, stealth jihadists use political, cultural, societal, religious, intellectual tools. Violent jihadists use violence. But in fact, they're both engaged in jihad. And they're both seeking to impose the same end state, which is to replace Western civilization with a radical imposition of Sharia. And let me be quite clear. And I could not disagree more with Dean Kagan in accepting the Saudi money to have professors of Sharia at Harvard. I couldn't disagree more with every university in America which teaches a transparently propagandistic version. Sharia in its natural form has principles and punishments totally abhorrent to the Western world, and the underlying basic belief, which is that law comes directly from God and is therefore imposed upon humans, and no human can change the law without it being an act of apostasy, is a fundamental violation of a tradition in the Western system which goes back to Rome, Athens, and Jerusalem, and which has evolved and given us freedom across the planet on a scale we can hardly imagine, and which is now directly threatened by those who would impose it. So, let me be also quite clear that the rules are radical and horrific. And I think, again, it's fascinating that even when people go out and do polling and they say to, for example, Muslims in general, do you believe in Sharia, they don't then explain what Sharia is. So Sharia becomes like, would you like to be a Rotarian? And it sounds okay. And let me give you an example that was on the news. I was doing Fox and Friends this morning, and coming across was that Iran, in trying to appease world opinion, has graciously agreed that a woman who'd been convicted of adultery would not be stoned to death. She'd be hung. And that was the moderation. I know you can't make these things up. I say to all of our friends on the left who believe in gay rights, the principle of Sharia is painful execution, not just death, painful execution. And how we don't have some kind of movement in this country on the left that understands that Sharia is a direct mortal threat to virtually every value that the left has is really one of the most interesting historical questions and will someday lead many dissertations to being written. So, I think we are faced, when you recognize, for example, that Sharia requires 4 male witnesses to rape, and in the absence of 4 male witnesses, the complainant is themselves guilty, and there's a case in the last year in Saudi Arabia of a woman who was gang raped, had no witnesses, and has since been beaten for having engaged in inappropriate behavior. Now, if you think I'm making this up, one of the things we're going to post at my personal scholar site at American Enterprise, which is aei.org, right? I always get confused between com and org, so I got to check with Brady. Is a case in New Jersey, which is, I mean, I ran across this in preparing the speech, and I was so astounded I didn't believe it. And Brady got the actual appeals court ruling, which we're going to post. A woman files for a restraint against her husband, who has been beating her, torturing her, and raping her for hours at a time. And the judge rules at the entry level that he's not guilty of any criminal actions because, in fact, in his interpretation of Sharia, those are his rights, and therefore would be an imposition on his religion to apply to him American law. The appeals court came back and cited the 1878 case involving polygamy and said, this is nonsense. We have a clear, long tradition in this country that you can't, in fact, interpose religion to commit criminal acts and claim that it was because your religion made you do it. But when you read the case, and I believe this man was sincere. This is not an evil man. This is a person who has found a rationale for a behavior system which is horrific and which we would never tolerate. And yet here is an American judge so confused by secular situation ethics that he was unwilling to impose American law on somebody who was clearly abusing somebody. Now, there are much less horrific examples of this. I would cite to you, for example, the case in Minnesota where a blind student was exempted from a course and given credit without attending because his seeing eye dog offended Muslim students. Now, the fact that the college didn't have the nerve to say, under the Americans with Disability Act, the blind student stays, and if you want to leave, that's your prerogative. If you want to know what appeasement is like in America, if you want to know why this is a problem here at home, this is the kind of stuff that's going on because nobody in our secular elites is prepared to stand up and defend Western civilization against the routine, steady erosion